Good afternoon. I'm here and feeling very honored to be able to introduce to you Lesley Page. Lesley Page is a midwife who lives in the UK. Her career has spanned decades and she's had many roles in many countries. Her experience includes hands-on practice, academic work, managing large services, being president of the Royal College of Midwives, developing national and international policy, and international development of high-quality midwifery and maternity care. Her focus now is on humanizing childbirth and supporting the transformative power of pregnancy and birth in the early weeks of life to get the best start in life and a better future. In 2014, she was made a commander of the British Empire for her services to midwifery. And she acknowledges and has asked us to acknowledge the joint work with many others for this presentation, such as Professor Sue Downe, Professor of Midwifery and founder of the International Normal Birth Conference, and Professor Jane Sandall, Professor of Social Science and Women's Health, who is a senior investigator. Lesley very much wanted to be with us today, but unfortunately could not, but she wanted so much to share something with you that she has recorded a presentation, which I'm going to start for you.
Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to be talking to you in this conference on reproductive justice. I'm talking to you from my home in Oxford, but unfortunately at the time of the conference I'll be travelling, and so I have to pre-record what I'm going to say. But nevertheless, I hope it will make an impact on you, and I look forward very much to speaking with you. I'm just going to be sharing my slides. I'm going to be talking for the next few minutes about the idea of changing of childbirth and humanizing childbirth. And I want to start with the idea of making the best start for the individual baby starting life, for the woman giving birth, becoming mother, or for the birthing person, for the partner or other parent of the child and the family, but the impact of that on wider society, but also then to move out into broader aspects of humanizing childbirth. And I want to start with this idea that childbirth is a time of promise and potential. And for us as society, actually helping every baby, every woman, every family reach their best their optimal human potential is really important to us as a society. It's an opportunity for the growth of love, for actually overcoming some of the problems, intergenerational problems, and moving into a more promising future. It's a time for developing optimal health and well-being and giving the very best chance in life. It's a time for joy, delight, and ecstasy. And if by any chance there is a traumatic outcome, or perhaps if a baby dies, it's an opportunity to give compassionate care. Childbirth is a critical and sensitive period in life, and so we should be thinking about reaching this promise and potential. And care is much more about thriving in the long term, not just surviving in the short term. A baby is conceived, grows inside the mother and enters the world. A woman is born as mother, a man becomes father or the partner parent, and a new family is formed. There is a possibility of the growth of love and optimal health and well-being, not only in the short term, but over a lifetime and into the next generation. If we think about positive experience of birth with health and well-being, we can see that that will pass on to the baby, on to other generations and out into society. Conversely, if there's a traumatic outcome or the woman has had a very bad experience of birth and is traumatized, that will impact on the child, on the rest of the family, and into future generations and out into society. This is a profound transition with physical and psychological change and changing family roles. Humanized childbirth, I would propose to you, is the basis of a better civilization. So I believe that humanizing childbirth is as important as the movement to mitigate climate change because of the intergenerational impact, because of the impact on the family, on the community, and into society. Imagine, for example, a woman who is traumatized by childbirth, who perhaps has physical trauma as a result of it, or a baby that is disabled by being born. But they are less capable of going into the community, playing a full part, working and building a better future for all of us. And so the question that I would like to pose is this: how might we realize the promise of childbirth, the potential of new life, and make safe, humanized childbirth a sustainable reality for every childbearing woman, every birthing person and her baby, every parent, every family, no matter what their circumstances and where they live? And we bring into this the idea of equality, of reducing the outcomes of disparities, in unequal outcomes. So like climate justice, reproductive justice is concerned not only with individuals, but is critical to our future, to human resilience, planetary and health service sustainability, and to our reproductive future. Care around childbirth can enhance the start of life, leading to health and well-being, happiness, confidence and capability, support bonds of love, strengthen families and communities, or it may spoil that start of life. Humanization draws from a different ethical and legal perspective than current maternity care. Different questions are raised, and I've talked to you about this fundamental question that I think all of us need to ask. So the question is, how might we realize the promise of childbirth, the potential of new life? We need, I think, to take insights from other disciplines such as climate change, and this may contribute to our debate about how to build better human future through a radical change in how childbirth is conceptualized and supported. I first learned about humanization of childbirth in Brazil. I visited in 2000 for one of the very early humanization of birth conferences, and it had gathered people from all around South America, people whose childbirth, whose maternity services were often brutal. They were dehumanizing. Women couldn't take a companion or a family member or their partner into the hospital with them to give birth. The cesarean section rate was very high. There was inadequate pain relief, inadequate support through pregnancy, labor and birth and afterwards. And this movement was a very radical grassroots movement, but also with a systematic approach to the development of the Cegonha, or the Stork network, to actually build maternity services where childbirth was humanized, where women had the opportunity to have a kind of birth that was right for them, and importantly, had the opportunity to have a normal or a straightforward physiological birth, but also the medical care that they needed. And this was a really vigorous, exciting conference. It actually changed my view on life. And I was so struck by all sorts of people, professionals, doctors, midwives, nurses, doulas, psychoanalysts, and also the charities, and midwives and different community members all came together and intensely discussed and worked out how we might humanize childbirth. I will never forget it. I've continued my friendship with Brazil, a country I love very much indeed. And I have so many good friends and colleagues there. And I do have to recognize how much I've learned from them. And this is me in a small humanized childbirth hospital in a suburb in Brazil, in Curitiba, with a team that I worked with over a number of days, watching, observing, talking with them about how they worked, learning so much from them. So I will never forget that experience and continue to be inspired by what's happening in Brazil, South America, and so many other countries. Of course, Brazil, like other countries, has been involved in a change of government, and that has created more difficulties for them, but still they're moving forward in a very courageous way. We have a lot of progress to build on, but in a moment I'll talk about the challenges or problems that we still have. We've got many routes to humanization of birth. We have the humanization movement from South America and Brazil that I've talked about. We have humanizing policies in much of the world, and we have very humanizing policies in the United Kingdom. We've moved from surviving to thriving, and there's been an emphasis on respectful care and a great deal of midwifery development, and mortality has been reduced around much of the world. But let's go back to the 1960s and the 1970s. And for the very first time, women themselves were asked about the experience of birth by Sheila Kitzinger, who wrote the first book which described the direct experience of women in childbirth and of mothering. So we had many visionary empirical scientists, we had practice change, protests and activism. Sheila Kitzinger, Frederick Leboyer, who talked about birth without violence, Kennel and Klaus, who brought to our attention the importance of the mother and baby staying together, the attachment, the bond of love between the mother and the baby. Michelle O'Donnell, understanding the problems of disturbing the physiology of birth. Ina May Gaskin and the farm and spiritual midwifery, and Bowlby, who showed us that babies need their mother or their main caregiver for love and attachment. And then the Boston Women's Health Collective, who wrote Our Bodies, Ourselves. So this feminist movement was really important. We also had the development of evidence-based care and human rights and birth rights as a basis to maternity and reproductive care, and an understanding of the absolutely vital importance of access to high-quality healthcare. These all serve as a foundation to humanizing childbirth around the world. Think, for example, about what Leboyer taught us. And since then, we try to keep the birth room dark and reduce the noise and handle the baby gently as they enter the world. These things are like bricks that build up a wall of humanizing childbirth for our future. But we do have a number of problems. And one of the problems that we've got in the in high-income countries, middle-income countries, and also in low-income countries is the medicalization of birth. And here I would describe it as a protest by which non-medical problems become defined as medical. where pregnancy and birth become the subject of the jurisdiction of medicine. Take, for example, the difficulty of women having a home birth. Often, birth is so medicalized that we believe it's safer for all women to give birth in hospital, rather than giving the opportunity of out-of-hospital birth centre or home birth care. And often community and family involvement is actually disregarded. It's disrespected. It isn't seen as important. When the normal phenomena of childbirth become problematic, a new consumer market is created. For example, cesarean section in private practice. We have fragmentation and standardization, and medicalization can become social control. It's deeply rooted in current and local cultures. This idea of the importance of not only the importance of medical care, because access to medical care is critically important, but medicalization, the overuse of medical procedures that aren't needed, the overuse of procedures that are life-saving, but used as routine. And there's a faith in technology, not human support and relationships. So we see a reliance on fetal monitoring through a machine, for example, but we often don't understand the importance of a midwife or a nurse with the woman, listening to the fetal heart, watching what's going on, and the importance of continuity of relationship and relationships within the family. So we've got a number of problems that we have to face. We have had progress, but it's inadequate and it's very, very patchy. We've been constrained by a lack of understanding of the significance of birth to human life, to the individual being born, to the woman becoming mother, and to the partner becoming parent, and the impact of that on their lives and on our lives. There have been barriers to development, and there have been dominant cultures of dehumanization, medicalization, and institutionalization of childbirth. Because bringing women into hospital was seen as a life-saving intervention. But in fact, hospital isn't always the best place to give care or for women to give birth. And often women are brought into very large institutions, large health services. And because we're looking after large numbers of women and their families, there's a great deal of standardization, which is the opposite to what we want to achieve in humanizing childbirth. In humanizing childbirth, we need to meet the individual needs, the preferences, the wishes, the health status of the woman, and her context. We need care that's tailored around her, that's actually wrapped around the woman and her baby. The problems that arise from this are of critical and pressing importance. We have the apparently contradictory problems of care that's too little too late, so lack of intervention, lack of access to medical care and healthcare when it's needed, and too much too soon, over-intervention. And often they're seen not just in separate countries, but actually even in the same local area or the same region. For example, in the United Kingdom a few years ago, we had the situation of a woman who was in prison and who gave birth on her own in her prison cell because she couldn't attract the attention of warders and couldn't get the midwifery and medical care that she needed at that time. We also have huge inequalities in access to care and variation in outcomes. In the United Kingdom recently, we've had a meeting, an all-party parliamentary group meeting, about African women. And African women, or women of African descent in the United Kingdom, are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. We also have, around the world, evidence of debilitating psychological trauma after birth in women and families, and that includes post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's not always related to the kind of birth, because women who've had an apparently normal or straightforward physiological birth can be traumatized, and women having a highly medicalized birth can find it a positive experience. And often we find it's because there's difficulty in the relationship with carers and a lack of autonomy, a lack of personal control for the woman. It's often associated with things like unnecessary, unwanted exams and treatments, disrespectful or abusive care, as well as failure to get consent for treatment. And separation of mother and baby is traumatic, both to the mother and the baby. Psychological trauma affects health workers too. We see moral distress created by circumstances that restrict humane care or involve staff in unethical processes. Often there's an organizational and societal lack of respect for them in their roles, and this particularly affects midwives. And in the United Kingdom at the moment, we have a particular problem with the press constantly and persistently vilifying midwives, whereas actually women themselves respect the midwifery profession. So the wonderful late Marsden Gardner said that in the maternity services, the people who work there, the professionals and other staff members, are like fish who can't see the water. They're like fish swimming in a goldfish bowl, and they can't see what's going on around them. Many of you who've worked in maternity services will know you go to work each day, you often work with people you know well. There might be routines, you might do the same thing every day. And what we're trying to do is to move away from this routine into meeting the needs of every woman, wrapping the woman and her baby around with care. Actually, often through an emphasis on continuity of relationship between women and their midwives and doctors or doulas or others. And Marsden Gardner, in the conference that I talked about a few minutes ago, said this: humanized birth puts a woman in the center and in control. It focuses on community-based primary maternity care with midwives, nurses, and doctors working together in harmony as equals, and has evidence-based services. Western medicalized high-tech maternity care under obstetric control usually dehumanizes, often leads to unnecessary, costly, dangerous, invasive obstetric interventions, and should never be exported to developing countries. Midwives and planned out-of-hospital births are perfectly safe for low-risk births. So, humanizing childbirth brings the changes required to enable the transformative and humanizing effects of birth to individuals, the family, community, and wider society. Pregnancy and birth is a liminal period. It's a period between one state of life, one stage of life, moving into another state of life or stage of life. Stage of taking on the responsibility for another human being, really for the rest of our lives and the rest of their lives. Even when children grow up, parents often feel a huge sense of responsibility for them. And this transformation is about the woman feeling more capable, more confident after her care, ready to take on this responsibility, and of course the partner or other parent too, and the family. And we mustn't forget that the physiology of, particularly of labour, birth, the early days and weeks of life, and breastfeeding, it has in itself a transformative effect. It primes a woman for mothering. It contributes to health and well-being. So there is a physiological basis to that transformation from one state of life or one stage of life to another. Humanising childbirth helps keep the promise of this new life and fulfills the potential of that new life. Humanised childbirth creates awareness of the significance of childbirth. Childbirth is much more than a medical event, but has huge meaning that will have an impact on our future, on our culture, on our families, and on our society and communities. By providing culturally, socially, and psychologically sensitive health and medical care that responds to the unique personal and healthcare needs of every woman, every birthing person, the baby and family. And the crux of humanisation lies in putting the woman, her baby and family at the centre of our concern and her care, with her circumstances and her needs uppermost, rather than the needs and routines of communities, institutions, health services, and professionals. We have a number of intersecting pathways, and I'm going to talk around a few key areas and then some of the details arising out of these areas and domains of knowledge. Human rights or birthrights are an important basis, as well as the evidence or science underlying care, knowledge and understanding, access to high quality health services. And I'm going to talk particularly about the importance of midwifery, although skilled, educated, compassionate care from all caregivers, doctors, midwives, doulas, nurses, and so on, all of the staff in maternity services and workers in the community. These intersecting pathways include raising awareness and acceptance of current advances, but also the problems that we face. We need to see things differently, to look at childbirth in the world from a different perspective, a different point of view. For example, we need to bring the scientific disciplines together. So if we're thinking about induction of labour, we might want to look at the studies on the outcomes of induction of labour, caesarean section, mortality, and so on. But we would also want to look at the impact that induction of labour has on physiology, the disturbance that it gives to the physiology of childbirth. There's the importance of regulated midwifery, educated, compassionate, skilled midwifery, and the World Health Organization and International Confederation of Midwives are absolutely critical to this area. We need really to change the conversation around birth. We shouldn't be talking now about single outcomes, as important as they are. Of course, the reduction of mortality is essential, but it's not adequate. We need to be thinking about thriving. And so we need to think both about reducing mortality rates, reducing morbidity, but also giving positive experience of care, women being able to make decisions about their own care, having had conversations with those who are caring for them around the evidence and putting it into the context of their own situation and their own healthcare needs. We need, as I said earlier, to learn from others, including the climate change movement, because the climate change movement, by the use, created a kind of grassroots policy, not fast enough. We still have huge problems, but there is still generally an awareness that climate change is a problem. Process around the needs of childbearing women and their families. It's important, I think, to imagine the best start for all concerned. And it might be that medical care and medical attention, healthcare is really important. We need to think about different ways of, for example, women's groups meeting together about what they want to see around childbirth, about including women's voices, maternity voices partnerships in the development and moving forward and evaluation of maternity services. We need to imagine a bit better humanising maternity services and communities, because it's often the community that will feed in and give some kind of direction and understanding to the maternity services. And we need to build communities for political, legal, and media activity to change the conversation. So with a few other people, we've been doing some work around knowledge domains of humanising childbirth, and you might have different ideas, but this is a start of that thinking. And I've mentioned some of these domains already. The significance of childbirth, the significance of health and well-being and capability and loving the baby and attachment and relationships within the family, the significance of that, not only to the baby and the woman or the birthing person and the family and the other parent, but also to wider community. The ability for a woman to go from having given birth and raising her family, but also working in the community, being economically active, contributing to a better world. Human and reproductive rights is a very important knowledge domain, the law, and the whole idea of the woman, her baby and family at the centre, the organisation of maternity services in high quality, high performing health services, the provision not only of hospital-based care, but of birth centres, community centres, home birth, community groups, perhaps areas in a high street or in a village where women can actually get advice and form relationships with other women in the same situation. And then, of course, the physiology of love and well-being around pregnancy, birth, and early life. And often that's off our radar screens. You rarely hear people who truly understand the role of the neurohormone, oxytocin, priming the woman for mothering, the role of the physiological adaptation in preparing the baby for extrauterine life, the role of physiology as well as psychology in preparing the mother to be fiercely protective of her baby. And then, of course, respectful care and relationships. And we know around the world, we see from disrespectful care to, quite frankly, abusive and cruel care. And that is an area that needs a lot of investigation and understanding about how we develop health services and caregivers who can work in a relationship of respect with the woman and her family. the knowledge for childbirth, so many scientific areas, not just biology, sociology, psychology, how organizations work, how we develop different cultures in organizations. And then, of course, responding to and understanding medicalization, dehumanization, and institutionalized services. And sociologists, anthropologists, so many people can help us understand this knowledge area. And then, of course, the idea of optimizing physiology and intervention. We know from the Lancet series on optimizing cesarean section that we should be ensuring that women have access to cesarean section when it's needed. It is a life-saving procedure, but it's used far too often, and it's often used when it's unnecessary. So we need to understand too how to help women who don't need or who don't want a cesarean section, how to avoid that cesarean section in a safe way that gives them a good experience. And this takes us away from the either or, the polarization, the either and. It's also and. And for example, when we're supporting physiology, the woman actually might need an intervention, might need an induction of labour, might need an assisted birth, might need a cesarean section. But in that situation too, optimizing physiology, for example, skin-to-skin care after a cesarean section, or support for breastfeeding are really important. This is a sensitive and critical period. It's the only birth of this person. It's the first love relationship. And Jenny the M, a wonderful midwife, talks about skin to skin being the first love embrace for the baby. We need services built around women and their communities, not services built for the professionals working within them or for the commercial interests in them. We need to respect and protect the physiology and psychology of the childbearing period. Childbirth is a time of liminality, a transformative event, and we need to bring together the scientific fields so that we understand things from the point of the woman, the mother, the birthing person, the baby, the family, the other parent. And we need to be able to respond to over-medicalization, dehumanization, and institutionalization. So for a moment, I want to talk about midwifery. As I said earlier, women need care from many different birth workers and professionals. They need care that's educated, that's skilled, that's compassionate. Care from people who can work with the woman, actually responding to her needs. But particularly important for humanizing childbirth is strengthening midwifery. And we're seeing a great deal of work around the world from the World Health Organization and from the International Confederation of Midwives and midwifery associations about the education of midwives. And it's very important to recognize that over the last 2 or 3 decades, since midwifery has become more academic in much of the world, many of the really important developments in the maternity services have come from midwife academics, midwife scientists, or about midwifery. For example, the Lancet series on midwifery. For example, the work on continuity of care, relationship-based midwifery. For example, the work on optimizing cesarean section, in which midwives played a really important role. the work in physiology of birth, labour and birth, and the early weeks of life, and breastfeeding, and of course pregnancy. We need to think about services where midwives have knowledge, skills and compassion. And we also need to think about how midwives, professional midwives, might work with traditional birth attendants. But we need to scale up professional midwifery. And one of the important areas for development, as I've mentioned earlier, is the development of relationship-based care, the development of organisations of midwifery, continuity of midwifery care, in which women can get to know one or a small group or team of midwives that they get to know over time, developing a relationship of knowing and trusting each other. And we know, for example, from the Cochrane Review of Midwifery Continuity of Care, that relationship-based care is associated with a lower risk of preterm birth, almost 25% lower risk of preterm birth, where women are cared for by a small team or a group of midwives getting to know each other over time. There's a lower risk of fetal loss and neonatal mortality. There's a lower risk of intervention, but the outcomes are good, they're safe. It's more satisfying for women, satisfying for midwives who want to work in that way, and can be protective of burnout. And of course, midwives have grasped the idea of evidence-based care. Midwives Information Resource Service was one of the first digests of research in any field of study in the world, here in the United Kingdom, and midwives have been involved in effective care in pregnancy and childbirth, and also the Cochrane Library doing the reviews, the meta-analysis, and the meta-overviews of the Cochrane Library. But at the basis of all of this, the midwife is with the woman, and it depends on a relationship, but it depends on listening to the woman, because ultimately the woman is a person who should make decisions about her own care. And so being able to listen and hear women and give them information in a way that's understandable to them, that can be applied to the context of their lives or their own healthcare background, their own medical problems if they've got any, and so on, is really important. And preserving physiology is particularly important for midwifery. But I think what's important for midwives like me, I've been a midwife since 1966. I went back to nursing for a little while, but I've been a midwife most of that time. You can, in very busy institutions where there's a lot of routines, you can forget the significance of what you do. And this is a baby coming into the world for the first time. And the woman becoming mother, the birthing person, becoming parent to the baby, and the partner, going into very dramatically different roles in life, and an understanding of the impact that this has on our society. And so reminding ourselves every so often. And I wanted to tell you a short story. When I first became professor of midwifery at Queen Charlotte's and Thames Valley University in London in England, we set up one-to-one midwifery, which was a very large development for continuity of midwifery care, with women having one named midwife, but that midwife working in partnerships or buddies in a group of 6 or 8 other midwives, so that the woman was always cared for, mainly by her native midwife, but other midwives that she had got to know and trust over time. And I actually undertook some clinical work in this development. And one day I went to see a woman who lived in a tiny house, clean, pristine, pretty little house, right on the edge of a high security prison, one with scrubs. And she'd been admitted to hospital. She had very severe antepartum hemorrhage, and I had got to know her quite well. And I went to visit her, and I was palpating her abdomen, feeling how the baby was growing and which position the baby was in, and seeing if the baby was kicking and talking to her about this. And she just looked at me and she said, "You know, Lesley," she had a real London accent. She said, "You know, Lesley, I just keep thinking and thinking and thinking about it. That I've got another person growing inside me, and I just can't get over it." And I looked her in the eye and we both became quite teary. And this was a real reminder to me of the significance of the intense experience of carrying another human being inside you, giving birth to another human being, and then taking on responsibility for that other human being. Responsibility and care that will affect the whole of their lives and other generations. And I think it's important too to remember that midwives can really influence others. I've noticed that midwives have a huge amount of information or understanding or experience and skill that they just take for granted. And then if they start to talk to other people about it, there's a growing understanding and awareness that's really important to all of us. So midwives everywhere should be respected. They should have a voice. They should be at the top level in policy making, both in government and in the health services and in universities. And I've had some wonderful visits to India. I've been hosted by Abhishek Bhatia of the Bhatia Institute in New Delhi, who actually took me to visit government hospitals and private hospitals and helped me understand the situation of India. And Avita Fernandez, who's actually been a key person, an obstetrician, in helping the government in their plan to introduce midwifery-led services across India. Very, very radical change, very important. And this is me with Lina Duncan, who had worked as a community with communities, women living on the railroad tracks around Mumbai. And here she took me for a morning to meet some of these communities and talk with them and understand their situation. And it was such an important, memorable day. I was so impressed by the courage that they show, the difficulty of their lives. But there were a few women who were pregnant and they had to go for a scan. And they didn't have the money to pay for a scan. So Lina and I gave them money for a scan. But so there was a maternity service in which women who were living on the railroad tracks, who had to find money for a scan, but there weren't community services built around them. There wasn't a sense of public health. And I knew when they went into hospital, the situation would be really difficult for them. The hospitals were well beyond capacity, and often women were just put flat on their backs on metal tables, sometimes without a sheet, their leg in stirrups. When they gave birth, there wasn't analgesia. and the cesarean section rate is rising. But this work to develop midwifery with Evita Fernandez and a colleague and friend of mine from India, from England, Indy Carr, is working with her. It's so important and is a really important way. And I hear that they're now having a lot of success. The Fernandez Institute is a place which has been educating midwives for years now, and they are improving the normal birth rate, improving the experience, doctors and midwives working together, understanding each other, making childbirth safer. It's a very wonderful and impressive development, and the World Health Organization has been very involved in that development. So just to go back over this idea that humanizing childbirth is about realizing a better future for us all. That when women give birth to a baby, if they're supported appropriately, if they have access to healthcare that they need, if they have staff who are skilled, educated, compassionate, understand, empathetic to the situation that women live in, we're actually going to create a much better future for all of us. And the International Confederation of Midwives, we developed this definition of humanization childbirth. Care that recognizes the significance of birth for individuals, family, and society, that respects human rights of the woman to access high-quality, evidence-based care. Humanized care puts the woman at the center of care, recognizes that the mother and baby are inseparable. They should never be separated. The woman and her baby and family are treated with dignity and respect, and the woman has a right to make decisions about her care. This decision-making process will be enhanced by a relationship of reciprocity with her midwife or midwives, and supported through the appropriate provision of high-quality information. I just had a chapter published in this wonderful anthology, which has been compiled by Dr. Julie Garland, and it tells a story of my life as a midwife and some ideas around humanizing childbirth. And I have a group of people that I work with that are really important. Downe from UCLan, Kaveri Myra, who was at the University of Southampton. She's from India originally. She's now in Vancouver. Teresa McCreary from Ireland. Lois McKellar, who was at the University of Southern Australia, but is now in Edinburgh. And Elizabeth Newnham from Griffith University, Australia. And Jane Sandall from King's College London. And some links to my recent blogs and my contact details. But I want to finish with this wonderful photo by a friend of mine, colleague from Iceland, Dr. Olafsdottir. I've got strong links with Iceland, wonderful community, very philosophical, and they have developed wonderful academic work, scholarship, but also developed midwifery services around Iceland that are really a model for all of us. In Iceland, the term midwife means mother of light, indicating not just the midwife being with the woman when the baby is born into the light of the world, but the whole idea of enlightenment of our midwifery knowledge, talking about our understanding, our learning, what we understand about birth, because midwives have a very privileged position. So enlightenment and working with women. Thank you very much for listening today. I hope it's made a difference to you. And my main aim is to have everybody thinking differently, asking different questions.
Okay, thank you all for attending. I noticed there was a question, and since Lesley is not with us, you might want to contact her. She is on LinkedIn, and I'm sure she would love to hear from all of you. Thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.